Very well, but it is ready, Honorable Cheptumo. Is that, can you confirm that?
Mr. Speaker, if you could give me a minute, because it was to be brought to me shortly.
Very well. Well,
Sorry, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to lay the following paper on the table of the House today, Tuesday, October 10th, 2017. Report of the Select Committee on the Election Laws 2017 on its consideration of the Election Laws Amendment Bill, National Bill number 39 of 2017. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
is it National Bill or National Assembly Bill?
National Assembly Bill 39 of 2017.
No, the answer should get you correct. Right, next order. Next order.
Order number 6, notices of motion.
Honorable Limo.
Honorable Speaker, I beg to give notice of the following motion. That this House adopts the report of the HADO Committee on Supplementary Estimates for the financial year 2017-2018, laid on the table of the House on Tuesday, October 10, 2017, and pursuant to the provisions of the Article 223 of the Constitution and Standing Order 243, approves, 1, an increment of the total recurrent expenditure for the financial year 2017-2018 by 63,513,309 in respect of the votes as contained in the schedule. 2, a reduction of the total capital expenditure for the financial year 2017-2018 by Kenya shilling 24,899,676 and 347 in respects. Okay, sorry, Mr. Speaker. It's 24,899,673 347 in respect of the votes as contained in the schedule. Number 3, an overall increment in the total budget for the financial year 2017-2018 by Kenya shilling 38,613,632,954 in respect of the votes contained in the schedule. And 4, further resolves that the schedule forms the basis of the enactment of the first Supplementary Appropriation Act 2017. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Cheptumo. Very well, very well. Then we move to the next order.
Order number 7, statements. Order number 8, the Computer and Cybercrimes Bill, National Assembly Bill number 36 of 2017. First reading. A bill for an act of parliament to provide for offenses relating to computer systems to enable timely and effective detection, investigation, and prosecution of computer and cyber crimes, to facilitate international cooperation in dealing with computer and cybercrime matters and for connected purposes.
Next order.
Order number 9, motion, approval of ratification of the protocol to operationalize the extended jurisdiction of the East African Court of Justice. Question to be put.
Order, members. Members, debate on this motion was concluded when the House last met, and therefore what remained is for the question to be put, which I hereby do. That cognizant of the report of the Select Committee on Regional Integration of the 11th Parliament on the ratification of the protocol to operationalize the extended jurisdiction of the East African Court of Justice, and pursuant to Section 8 of the Treaty Making and Ratification Act of 2012, this House approves the ratification of the protocol to operationalize the extended jurisdiction of the East African Court of Justice. Will as many as that opinion say aye? Aye. As many as the contrary opinion say nay? The ayes have it. Next order.
Order number 10, the Election Laws Amendment Bill, National Assembly Bill number 39 of 2017, second reading.
Honorable Cheptumo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the Election Laws Amendment Bill, National Assembly Bill number 39 of 2017, be read a second time. Mr. Speaker, on 1st of September 2017, the Supreme Court, with a majority decision of 4 judges, nullified the elections of President Uhuru Kenyatta. Mr. Speaker, the court further directed that the IABC be able to conduct elections within 60 days, Mr. Speaker, from that date. And Mr. Speaker, the issues raised by the Supreme Court were and still remain disturbing, especially as we head onto the fresh presidential elections ordered by the court. Mr. Speaker, as a patriot, a Kenyan, a leader, an elected member of the great people of Baringo North, Mr. Speaker, I could not sit and contemplate the possibility of deficiencies highlighted by the court, as well as other challenges that arose from the election process. Mr. Speaker, sir, as you may recall, there was also several cases, Mr. Speaker, filed by in the High Court by a number of Kenyans prior to the elections on 8th of August, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, allow me to quote 3 cases that were filed before the elections of 8th of August. That is the Peter Solomon Kishiri for IABC and another. That is petition number 234 of 2017, where the court held that Section 29 of the Elections Act contravened the letter and the spirit of the Constitution in Article 38 on political rights, Mr. Speaker, as read together with Article 137, 1D. Mr. Speaker, the second case is that one of Kenneth Otieno versus Attorney General. That is again petition 127 of 2017, where again the court held that Section 44 Article 44 Article 8 offends the Constitution. And finally, Mr. Speaker, referring to those 3 cases is the IABC versus Minor KI and 5 other. Mr. Speaker, equally, another issue also was addressed here, and it was held that the presidential election results declared by the constituency returning officer are final in respect of constituency and can only be questioned by an election court. So, Mr. Speaker, you can see from what I've said so far that in those three cases, issues, Mr. Speaker, of concern touching on the election process in the country have arisen in those three cases. And I said, Mr. Speaker, there are well over 8 cases of that nature, raising various issues, constitutional, legal, that, Mr. Speaker, I could not sit and wait as a responsible, patriot citizen of this country and as a leader. Mr. Speaker, the bill which I have sponsored also seeks to align the Election Act with 3 decisions I have referred to, and in effect align the Act with the relevant provisions of the Constitution. Mr. Speaker, that is the foundation, that is the basis, among others, Mr. Speaker, that I felt it was important for me to come forth before this August House and be able, Mr. Speaker, to take the challenge and raise these concerns. Mr. Speaker, close reading of election-related laws also reveal that gaps in the law, indeed, Mr. Speaker, where there are gaps in law, there can be as many and variant interpretation as you can get depending on the number of lawyers interpreting. Mr. Speaker, this is a highly litigious country where every Kenyan and lawyers, Mr. Speaker, will have different interpretation for various situations of various laws. The bill, therefore, Mr. Speaker, proposes specific amendments to fill existing gaps in our scheme of laws and may lead to a legal and constitutional crisis if not addressed prior to the conduct of the fresh elections. Mr. Speaker, before highlighting the content of the bill and thinking behind it, I am under obligation to note that the upon bill being read a first time, Mr. Speaker, this House approved a motion where members of this House, Mr. Speaker, under my chairmanship, was approved through the motion by our majority leader, Mr. Speaker, and that committee, Mr. Speaker, was mandated to look into these laws and take public participation, Mr. Speaker, which I would like to report to the House, Mr. Speaker, that indeed, for close to a week, Mr. Speaker, we had time to listen to the members of the public. And Mr. Speaker, allow me at this point in time to very sincerely thank the Kenyan people, institutions, both private and government institutions, Mr. Speaker, which had time to come before us. Mr. Speaker, there were even areas where sometimes Kenyans were being told not to go before the committee. Mr. Speaker, Kenyans refused to listen to that call. They came forward, Mr. Speaker, and they spoke what they think about this proposed amendment, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to say here, in this August House, Mr. Speaker, that the perception that was created outside there, that these proposed amendments were meant or geared towards working or benefiting one coalition of this House, Mr. Speaker, far from the truth, Mr. Speaker. I want to say that, Mr. Speaker, we stood as a House, as a committee of the House, duly established and constituted, Mr. Speaker, in accordance with our laws, the standing orders and the Constitution, and we represented all Kenyans, Mr. Speaker. We received both those who supported the amendments and those who did not support the amendments, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, during the public hearings, we received views from members of the public, religious groups, constitutional commissions, professional associations, civil society, organizations, non-governmental organizations, members of business community of formal and informal sector, information communication, technology, organizations, the media, political parties, related institutions, and in particular, Mr. Speaker, the IABC. Mr. Speaker, I want to inform the nation that we received views from across all sectors of our society, Mr. Speaker, and I'm proud that Kenyans were able to take advantage of that public participation process to come forward and input, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my colleagues will realize when you go through the report that we've been able to table today, that, Mr. Speaker, the comments were overwhelming, Mr. Speaker, because we captured every Kenyan in the answer, Mr. Speaker, from the memorandums and so on. And so members of this House, Mr. Speaker, will have a chance also to go through those in our report.
Honorable Cheptumbo, just 1 minute for me to indicate to members that the report is available in the is it room number 8?
Yeah, yes, Mr. Speaker. I thank you for
that even as you move, that tell members that the report is available. Those who may be interested can have a look at it, because it will help guide the debate.
Correct. Yes. So, Mr. Speaker, I indeed agree, and I've already actually even shared earlier with my colleagues, but let me also emphasize, because others were perhaps not present, that we have enough copies of our report in room number 8. So members feel free to have a copy, so that as we input in this second reading, Mr. Speaker, of the bill, we are able to have informed debate, because they are very, very important issues raised by the members of the public, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, further, the proposal contained in the report just tabled shall inform the basis of the amendments that I shall move to the bill at the committee stage on behalf of the committee. Mr. Speaker, it is important for me at this point to mention that we were not doing public participation, Mr. Speaker, in vain. It was not a public relation exercise, Mr. Speaker. And that is why, after listening to the public, Mr. Speaker, there were valuable ideas that informed the committee, Mr. Speaker, in even actually dropping some of the amendments that we feel we had to listen to what the public says. Mr. Speaker, I shall therefore note the clause in which I am fully in agreement with the committee proposal in some of the clauses that we propose. Mr. Speaker, therefore, allow me now to move to the specific clauses of the bill. Mr. Speaker, clause 2 of the bill, and I believe my colleagues have copies of those of the bill, because it is important as I take you through, you refer to those sections, Mr. Speaker. Clause 2 of the bill, Mr. Speaker, says of our election, Mr. Speaker, is actually manual. The only time electronic process came in play, Mr. Speaker, is at a time of transmission of the results to the National Tallying Center. Mr. Speaker, it is therefore important for this House to give equal weight to the manual transmission. And Mr. Speaker, again, the question is, what is this called manual transmission? Is it possible to have manual? And Mr. Speaker, shockingly, when the IABC appeared before us, they agreed with us, with that lady. And Mr. Speaker, IABC even went further and said, instead of using manual transmission, they said we need to use physical delivery. Mr. Speaker, the framers of the Constitution was not wrong when we provided under Article 118 for public participation. We could not have had a time to listen to that lady from 30 constituents to tell us. And so, Mr. Speaker, I want to stand before this House and say that we want to give equal weight to the process of manual transmission, which is actually physical delivery of the results. And so, Mr. Speaker, in the third reading of this bill, as a committee again, Mr. Speaker, I'll be moving some amendments to that particular clause 6, so that we provide for that position. Mr. Speaker, in addition, clause 6 of the bill seeks to address an issue determined by the High Court of Kenya in minor KI case, which I had highlighted earlier. This is with regard to the expression professional results, which led the court to declare the current section 39, 2 and 3 of the Elections Act unconstitutional. So, Mr. Speaker, again, our intention under clause 6 is again to clean up our laws so that what has been declared as unconstitutional in section 39, 2 and 3 is removed from our books, our laws, so that, Mr. Speaker, we move forward. Mr. Speaker, I know my time is, I want to move now to clause 7 of the bill, seeks to amend section 44 of the Elections Act in the usage of technology in elections. The clause seeks to amend section 5 of section 44 of the Elections Act to exclude political parties as a specifically identified category of stakeholders. It further seeks to give the Commission a general power to make regulations with respect to the use of technology. This shall ensure that the Commission has the direction to provide for the most appropriate mechanism for the use of technology in electoral processes. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, the amendment proposes the deletion of subsection 6, 7 of section 44 of the Act, as these provisions, again, are applicable to the election held on 8th. Mr. Speaker, subsection 6, subsection 7 relates to provisions dealing with elections held on 8th, so not relevant again in this particular case. Mr. Speaker, that is the position in Kenneth Otieno versus Attorney General and another petition number 127 of 2017. Mr. Speaker, allow me to be of the bill. Will have taken care of provision of electronic transmission of results and the manual, as I've said earlier. And therefore, we want in proposed 44A to only provide for a complementary system for voter identification, because it is equally critical, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, sir, clause number 9 of the bill seeks to amend section 83 of the Elections Act 2011. This section was the focus of presidential elections. The Supreme Court was of the view that the petitioner had the burden of proving that the election was not conducted in accordance with the principles laid out in the Constitution and the electoral laws, or that the non-compliance with the principles laid out in the Constitution and the election laws affected the result of the election. According to the court, Mr. Speaker, it was bound by the decision of Parliament to code the provision in a distinctive form. The court states as follows, and I don't need to read that, Mr. Speaker. What we are saying here, Mr. Speaker, is that section 83 has two aspects. One is that in an election petition, it is the business of the petitioner to establish one aspect of that section. If you can prove that elections were not done in accordance with the Constitution, then an election can be nullified. Same also for the second part of that particular section, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what we would like to propose is that it will be the business of the petitioner to ensure that you prove to the Supreme Court that the election was not conducted in compliance with the Constitution. And two, that non-compliance of the Constitution and the laws indeed substantially affected the results. Mr. Speaker, the problem is that when laws are ambiguous, it is subject to interpretation from different people. We want the law to be clear. We are going for elections on 26, Mr. Speaker. We have a chance to amend the laws to realign so that should this issue arise again, Mr. Speaker, in future, we will not be accused for watching and waiting until it is too late. Mr. Speaker, sir, this is the position. And I would like to say that in our region, we have the same provisions as proposed in this amendment bill in Nigeria, in Ghana, Zambia, Tanzania, and Uganda. How we did not provide our laws to be realigned in that manner, Mr. Speaker, I can't explain, but that is not relevant now. What is relevant is for us as a House to now make a decision and be able to amend our laws. Mr. Speaker, I'm concluding, as you go to clause number 10 of the bill, seems to insert section 86A. And Mr. Speaker, in a nutshell here, presidential elections are covered in 3 situations, Mr. Speaker. One, normal under Article 138. Then we have the runoff. And then we have, Mr. Speaker, the elections presidential anticipated under Article 140, subarticle 3, which arises after nullification of elections. Mr. Speaker, whereas the other 2 scenarios, they are clear constitutional provisions, Mr. Speaker, we have a problem with regard to elections presidential under Article 143. The law is silent, the constitution is not very clear, and Mr. Speaker, a case of election like the one arising on 26th of October this year. And so, Mr. Speaker, that is the essence of of my proposal, clause number 10 of the bill. I want to summarize because I see my time is over. Mr. Speaker, finally, is clause number 11, touching on the issue of enhancing the penalties for a returning officer and presiding officer, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we went through the law, we looked at the Elections Act, Section 6 of the Elections Act, Mr. Speaker. We listened to the Kenyan people, and Mr. Speaker, it is clear that the provisions of Section 6 of the Elections Act has very elaborate provisions touching on offenses by an officer of IBC. And so, Mr. Speaker, what we only did is that we enhanced the penalties from 3 million to 5 million with an option of fine. And so, Mr. Speaker, I will also be moving an amendment to this particular section of the bill in the third stage, or third reading of this bill. Mr. Speaker, sir, that brings me to the end of my submission on this matter. But allow me, Mr. Speaker, to conclude as I invite my colleague to second, that we want to be very clear, Mr. Speaker. There was issues about timelines, that you are rushing the bill, that the timing is wrong, unconstitutional. That day solves the what? Sorry, Mr. Speaker. I want to say, Mr. Speaker, the responsibility of this House, as stated in the Constitution, we have no limited time. We have no time frame within which to make laws, whether to amend, create new laws. We have that unlimited time. And Mr. Speaker, those who allege this position also know that we have no limited time to legislate. And I want to thank my colleagues for having time. Some of them came even before the committee, Mr. Speaker, to give their views. And so I want to call upon leaders of this country, those who are opposed to this law, that we want to make laws for posterity, for this generation and the one to come, and the other to come in future. We have no intention whatsoever, Mr. Speaker, as the chair and my committee, that we did not do this law for Jubilee, for Uhuru Kenyatta. We did this law for Kenyan people, for posterity, for future. And Mr. Speaker, I think at this point in time now, it is now clear, Mr. Speaker, that this law was meant to benefit Kenyans. And I'm proud, Mr. Speaker, that this House has gotten a chance to clean up our laws so that we have clear provision of our laws, Mr. Speaker. I want, therefore, Mr. Speaker, to thank you, and I want to thank my members of the committee for spending close to 2 weeks, Mr. Speaker, in this House and within Parliament, right?
Now, in fact, I want to give you 1 minute to make a very profound statement for purposes of Hansard, because I know, I can recall when you began by giving
there is a server. My mother doesn't know what a server is. She doesn't know that a password or those kind of issues. Mr. Speaker, these laws also addresses the negligence of those officials of IABC, the presiding officers, the returning officers, those who are not going to sign or do their work diligently. So that in case you are a presiding officer, because, Mr. Speaker, there's so many errors, the Form 34, the Form 35, Cs and Bs, those which was pronounced at the Supreme Court, Mr. Speaker, that they were not signed. Actually, many of them, they were from the opposition side, Mr. Speaker. When they saw they lost, they called their people, they called their officers not to sign those forms, just to support them so that they can get a leeway. And the law which we are discussing today in this House, Mr. Speaker, is that when you are a presiding officer, when you are an election officer, you have a responsibility to this country and to the so many millions of voters in this country. If you don't sign your form, if you don't stamp your form, if you don't do what is expected of you, you should carry the cross. What is wrong with that, Mr. Speaker? I think we need to have these people work responsibly. Mr. Speaker, we want to ask Kenyans outside there who are saying that we are rushing these laws. From this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, where I'm talking, we are supporting this bill. From this side of the House. We don't have a problem. So it is the right bill, Mr. Speaker, and we want to ask Kenyans to prepare themselves for the repeat of presidential elections come 26th next week, Mr. Speaker. And for those, Mr. Speaker, who are seeking to demonstrate, Mr. Speaker, which is also provided for in the Constitution, let them do their demonstration peacefully. Let them stop violence and destruction of properties, Mr. Speaker. Because as we speak, Mr. Speaker, there is no vacuum of leadership in this country. President Uhuru is still the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He's still the president of Kenya, Mr. Speaker. So we should not be careful, honorable members. This is legislature. We have the right to legislate any law. Like we don't direct the judiciary what they are supposed to do. So we don't expect anybody to tell what this House not to do and what to do, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to support this bill. I know there is I have even amendments, but when we go to the third reading of this bill, Mr. Speaker, we encourage members to bring amendments so that we make a law for posterity of this country and prosperity of this country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I support.
Very well. And of course, Article 94, Clause 5 says that no person, body, has power to make provision having the force of law except Parliament. That is the Constitution, and does not say when it is you should do it. That does not tell you should do it in December or in January or February. So it is good, Honorable Kangogo, you have said it loudly, but I wanted it to be said by somebody else who I can see, the member representing who was in Yishu County, Honorable Gladys Sholei. The one.
You powered mine.
No.
Mine is working. It's working, yeah. Mr. Speaker, and fellow members, it's my pleasure to take the floor of this august House, not only to make remarks on the business at hand, which is the Electoral Amendment Bill 2017, but also to make my maiden speech, as is the parliamentary tradition. Mr. Speaker, I want to start by thanking the people of Uasin Gishu County, the home of champions, the source of champions, and the city of champions, for choosing me as their representative. I will endeavor to my utmost to articulate their issues and legislate in matters that are dear to their hearts. Mr. Speaker, I'm honored to be here in these chambers and would like to point out that indeed I have now served in all the three arms of government. I served at the executive as CEO of the National Council for Law Reporting, also as Deputy CEO at the Electoral Commission, and also at the Judiciary as Chief Registrar, and finally now in this National Assembly as a legislator. And on a light note, I can now say I'm a total public servant. Mr. Speaker, the import of this brief history is that I have interacted with electoral laws in various capacities and in various stages of my public service life. Mr. Speaker, I think at IABC, then the Electoral Commission, which was formed after the 2007 election violence, and also as part of the recommendations by the Kriegler report, at that time, we were able to run the first ever referendum in the history of Kenya, which gave birth to the current constitution. This was the first time that technology was used for biometric registration in that particular election. Honorable Mr. Speaker, in 2013, while at the judiciary and as chief registrar, we handled the first presidential election petition under the new constitution, that the amendments were necessary, and that all these legislative enactments that needed to be undertaken were to ensure that in conformity to the constitution, elections would be free and fair. Mr. Speaker, interestingly, we are here again, yet again to address perceived shortcomings in our laws that were raised by the 2017 presidential election petition in our courts. And Mr. Speaker, I would like to point out that review of laws in general and in principle shows a willingness to adapt and to new thinking and evolving situations. And hence the reason why I support these current amendments. If you remember and if we recall our history, Mr. Speaker, in 2007, the Kriegler report did make recommendations for electoral laws, new electoral laws. And at that time, our predecessors in this same parliament managed to pass a law establishing a new body called the IABC, which exists today, that was supposed to manage elections. It also required IABC to implement in electronic systems for managing, tallying, and sending the results, election results. Mr. Speaker, all these recommendations have largely been implemented by the Electoral Commission. The recommendations also of the Kriegler report did not only stop at election management. It included electoral dispute resolutions, and hence the reason why our predecessors in this parliament were able to pass legislation that put a statutory limit to the amount of time that you can hear an election petition, hence the limit to 6 months, which we are benefiting from today. Mr. Speaker, I wish to draw your attention to both the minority and majority decisions of the Supreme Court 2017 decision, which recommended that there has to be changes to our electoral decisions. And therefore, it is my hope that this House will approach this debate in a sober and a bipartisan manner. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I wish now to bring my attention to the amendments that are before us. The first amendment in relation to the position of the chair of the Electoral Commission. I must say I support this amendment because nature abhors a vacuum. So does the law, and thus it follows that public office abhors a vacuum. It is therefore in order to make amendments to ensure that that vacuum does not exist. If you all recall, more recently, when the Chief Justice, Dr. Mutunga, retired, the Vice Chair of the JSC was able to perform the duties of the chair to ensure that there was no vacuum. It is therefore in order to have similar legislation in relation to the Electoral Commission. Mr. Speaker, the same goes to the powers given to the commissioners that would be acting as chair at that time. Mr. Speaker, if I may speak to one of the other amendments to Clause 5, which proposes to delete Section 29 of the Elections Act. This amendment is also pursuant to a court decision, the Gishira versus IABC case, and therefore it is in order and should get all our support. Also, I wish to speak to another amendment, Clause number 6, which seeks to amend Section 39 of the Elections Act to provide for electronic transmission and physical delivery of the results to ensure that at any stage, any discrepancies detected are capable of being checked against the source documents, which is the polling station, which is the final result. Mr. Speaker, I would like to state that the proposed amendments are not in any way meant to water down the constitutional principles of holding free and fair elections and transparent elections. Rather, the amendments are to anchor these principles in practice via statute. Mr. Speaker, legislative amendments to laws following a court decision are not unique to Kenya. All of us know that in the United States, congressional overruling of Supreme Court decisions is not particularly an exceptional event. It is therefore not for the first time that is happening in Kenya. And I hope that our international partners who are watching us should not make it look like it is only the Kenyan parliament that is making amendments following a decision. It happens all the time in the United States, and it is an ongoing tug of war between the Congress and the US Supreme Court. It occurs from time to time in the US, and the Congress may feel that they need to fill some of the gaps which in the court's opinion prevent improper interpretation, or sometimes actually to undo what we believe is imprudent precedent established by our courts. We are therefore in order, as this 11th Parliament, in making these amendments to these laws. Mr. Speaker, as a general proposition, this type of dialective intercourse between the court and Congress is valuable and even creates friction because it checks the errors by each of the coordinate branches. Mr. Speaker, I will conclude by stating that I believe and support this amendment because it will only ensure that our future elections will be efficient, transparent, and thus living up to the constitutional thresholds of holding elections. I support the amendments. Thank you.
The member for Marakwet East talked about this side of the House. Member for Laikipia County.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, this afternoon. I'm glad to be contributing from the other side of the House, and I want to confirm to Kenyans that this side of the House is very sound, very vibrant, and excited about the amendments and the bill that is in front of the House this afternoon. Mr. Speaker, I want to confirm also to our dear Kenyans that there is nothing wrong as far as what I'm hearing the members from my side here complain, that the qualification of the chairman of the IABC must be that of a judge of the High Court. Mr. Speaker, there was an opportunity that the members of opposition wanted to exploit by making sure that they do a demonstration and they do mob justice against one Wafula Chebukati and also Ezra Chiroba, which, Mr. Speaker, we must tame this afternoon by making sure that the powers that the chairman has can also be the same powers a vice chair can hold in the absence of chairman. So if anybody thought that by sticking Ezra Chiroba or by taking Wafula Chebukati to the streets of Nairobi, we will create room for them to create a constitutional crisis, then we want to tell them they are very wrong, and that one is coming to an end this afternoon. Mr. Speaker, we also want to confirm that the quorum, there have been problems with the commissioners of IABC. And for some reasons, Mr. Speaker, because I know there are some people who have been thinking that the chairman, if he has there are internal wrangles within the constitution, he will take advantage of some members by making sure they do not attain the necessary quorum. We are making sure that we are going to give them Warobaina this afternoon, and Mr. Speaker, the quorum shall be 3 members. Mr. Speaker, thirdly, we want to confirm to Kenyans that the role of the chairman, because yesterday you remember the lawyer who is representing the IABC, the lawyer Paul Moita, Mr. Speaker, appeared before the Supreme Court asking for interpretation and clarity on the mandate of the chairman, Mr. Speaker, on that crucial day which is coming on 26th, Mr. Speaker. It is very clear, and from what the committee has done, Mr. Speaker, he will verify, and he is ready to address, and he should be ready to address discrepancies, Mr. Speaker, which would come up, Mr. Speaker, from the physical and digital transmission of the results, Mr. Speaker, which will be at the National Tallying Center. Mr. Speaker, we also want to address a challenge, Mr. Speaker, that made the IABC to be taken to the court by the members of opposition on the live transmission of the results. We want to declare it is not into the interest of the government of Jubilee to deny any Kenyan citizen information which they feel is it is a matter of importance to them and importance to the state. Mr. Speaker, we'll make sure that the IABC, Mr. Speaker, they do their job and make sure we get live transmission of results as much as the county tallying center, Mr. Speaker, will be relaying results to the National Tallying Center manually. Mr. Speaker, it is an offense for anybody who is working for IABC in the name of an officer or a presiding officer, Mr. Speaker, not to do their job willingly, or if money will be poured or has been poured or will ever been poured, Mr. Speaker, let anybody know that they will be taken capable of their own problems, and Mr. Speaker, this afternoon will make sure they will stay where they belong, because criminals, whether civil or whichever, Mr. Speaker, they have their special place where they should be put. Mr. Speaker, I also want to address the technicalities, Mr. Speaker, like what the committee has done that are in the clause 9, Mr. Speaker, which were addressing on the technicalities, Mr. Speaker, which made the Supreme Court to nullify the 8th of 8th general election, Mr. Speaker. We want to make sure that nobody, and especially the members who are in the opposition, led by one, the former Prime Minister, Raila Odinga, will not get an opportunity to rush to the court, claiming that there were technicalities that he cannot prove, cannot ascertain, and claiming that we did not have a credible election, Mr. Speaker. And by the virtue of this bill, I want to confirm to Kenyans that once we pass this bill, we will make sure that anybody that takes the IABC or the commission to the court must prove beyond reasonable doubt, Mr. Speaker, that they have got substance, which is credible, that can prove that there was non-compliance from the IABC, Mr. Speaker. Finally, I want to concur with the members of the committee that
48 hours, which nobody would have come to stop. Mr. Speaker, we thank the institutions of this country, which are intact. Mr. Speaker, if you look at the stool, it has 3 legs, just like the state, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. Mr. Speaker, the country can do without a judiciary for a moment. Mr. Speaker, the country can do without parliament, even for 4 years or 5 years. It cannot last without a president for 1 hour. Mr. Speaker, when we talk of the presidency, it is a confluence on which all the other institutions revolve around. And it is for this reason, Mr. Speaker, we should not take it casually when somebody says that I went to the Supreme Court, got a ruling, and I may wish to withdraw. Mr. Speaker, the Constitution and the laws of this land are being addressed very well. When you go to a polling station, like the chairman of the ad hoc committee ably described, we had no problem. The problem came in when somebody went to court and they complained about the process. And this judge of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, put it very well. He said, we are not addressing an event. It is a process. Now this afternoon, Mr. Speaker, the country is invited to address the anomalies that might have been in that process. As of now, Mr. Speaker, the country cannot take results manually because the law prohibits us from doing so. Now, when we wanted to say that we need a simultaneous or an alternative method, Mr. Speaker, we should be able to get support of every Kenyan, even those from the other side of the House. Mr. Speaker, this country is for all of us. And as you've seen, the issues that we have been grappling around about the uncharted waters we've been going through into an agenda that we don't have to care about the details of what is happening to our future and to our posterity. I had somebody complaining, saying that the story of the economy doesn't arise. Mr. Speaker, we are having economic problems for the last 90 days or for the last 1 year because of political uncertainties. Mr. Speaker, when we want to reward the hard-working Kenyans, ask anybody who is in business. Whatever you sell, whether it is food, whether it is service, whether it is petrol, nothing is working or adding up because of the political uncertainty arising out of a careless Supreme Court ruling that did not go into details of what they were putting the country into. We respect the ruling. But, Mr. Speaker, if you look carefully, they were not aware what they were driving us as a country into. They did not anticipate all the mischievous or the mischief of our leaders who don't care about the country, who are not patriotic. Because patriotism, Mr. Speaker, is an invitation to call to answer the call of duty for the country, not to the individual. So, Mr. Speaker, when we get into the issue of the candidates who want to withdraw from election, they think they can create a crisis. The Constitution and the law, Section 138, 139, and 140, they are very specific. They anticipate the absence of another candidate because of death, and they say what should happen. They don't anticipate mischief, malice, bad intentions, and bad manners of politicians. So, Mr. Speaker, as we address these clauses, the amendments this afternoon, we need to worry about our own country and say very clearly, we love it more than we love the individuals. Thank you.
Member for Gitutu Church North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving me a chance to contribute this important motion. Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Court ruled that our votes don't make any sense on the 8th of August, and that we must repeat the polls. They also ruled that those elections will be conducted by IABC as it is today. Mr. Speaker, I saw members of the opposition rejoicing, dancing in town. Even that leader I saw with the grandchildren dancing in town for the judgment which had been made in his favor. But I'm surprised. Apparently, he never accepted the entire judgment. The judgment said that the elections have been nullified and they will be conducted, fresh elections will be conducted within 60 days. Now, he accepted the nullification, but he doesn't seem to have accepted that the fresh elections to be conducted by IABC. He's giving conditions and terms, what he calls irreducible demands against IABC. At one time, he said we should respect independent institutions like the judiciary. which we do, which our side has respected. We have said we don't agree with the decision, but we respect it because it has been made by the proper institution. How come he doesn't respect an independent institution called IABC? IABC is as independent as a judiciary. If you respect the judiciary, then you should respect IABC and those others. Mr. Speaker, we have since learned that the decision was made on fake documents, Mr. Speaker, we have not gone on the streets to demonstrate that actually how could that decision be made on fake documents. Instead, we have abided by the decision of the Supreme Court, and we are campaigning for the election to be done on the 26th of this month. If for any reason the other candidate fears, and I can see he has cause to fear, because the few people he had, half of them are moved over to Jubilee. So he doesn't want to be embarrassed when he receives, instead of receiving 6 million votes, he receives 1 million votes from Nyanza. So that's why maybe he may want to withdraw. And I understand that, and sympathize with him. But has he withdrawn? If he has withdrawn with reason. Because he saw he's going to garner very few votes. But why should he put Kenyans in trouble, into violence? Why should he put us into violence? Yesterday, and he seems not to mind, yesterday, some 3 people were knocked down by a vehicle who were demonstrating. One person was shot in the foot. He doesn't care, he doesn't feel sympathy for those people who are suffering because of his demand for demonstrations in the country. On Friday, I read a story in the Star newspaper where there were 2 young ladies in Mathare. One is 19 years old, and the other is 21 years old. These 2 ladies lost their husbands during the announcement of the declaration of Uhuru as a winner, where his opponent asked people to demonstrate against that declaration. And those 2 young girls have lost their husbands. It doesn't seem to affect him at all. He has no sympathy for those 2 young girls with 1 child each. He wants to put more and more young girls in that situation. And I don't know what's become of Kenyans. Why can't Kenyans think about this? Which is better, to handle the situation in Parliament or to handle it in the demonstrations in the streets? Which is better, to read a motion in Parliament or destroy a supermarket in Kisumu? Which is better, to campaign peacefully or to campaign through demonstrations with the consequences? Those people, the IABC, and we want to tell them, stay firm, you are Kenyans. The same way these people who are demanding for your removal are Kenyans. Stay firm. Stay firm, because the Constitution provides very well that in section 26 of the Constitution, so in 26, no person can be violently be removed from his position or from wherever he's staying. You cannot, that's a right. You cannot be removed from wherever you are violently. And now the NASA, our NASA friends, I don't know whether they are friends or opponents, are demanding violently to remove those officers from IBC. They are going against the Constitution. I was even surprised why the DPP has not taken them to court, investigated them, taken them to court, because they are violating the rights of those officers of IBC. Mr. Speaker, this country is great for us. We are now going to spend another 15 billion shillings to do this fresh election. If we don't have to go through there, that money could have been used to provide jobs for maybe close to 100,000 young people. But now we are spending it because of somebody who can never be satisfied unless he wins. And he cannot win because Kenyans have known him, that he cannot provide proper leadership. That's why he has been trying for the last 4 times, and he loses. And every time he loses, he demands that the election board, the election body, must be dissolved. Why can't we ask him, if we want to agree to dissolve this election body, then we ask him to bring his mother, bring his wife, bring his child to be the members of IABC. Maybe then he will be satisfied. Because he will never be satisfied. He demanded for Kivui to be out. Kivui was out. He demanded for Hassan to be out. Hassan was out. He has now demanded Kina Chebukati and this group to be out. And if we are going to accept that, then we should ask him to provide us members of his family to be either to be the chairperson. Is he a lawyer? No. Now, and the others to be the commissioners, so that he can be satisfied. And they will carry elections. But I know, even if they were the commissioners, there's no way we will win against Oruruto. These people have done their job very well for Kenyans. They are doing much more for Kenyans, and they are peaceful. They don't want to go around and have people's kids be killed. So therefore, they have got even wider support now than they had on 8th of August. Mr. Speaker, there are those who are complaining that why are we rushing the law? Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Court pronounced itself and said, if we conduct this with these irregularities, we can nullify the election again. And we don't want to go that direction. So what we do, we correct and make some laws which will make it impossible for people to make those irregularities and illegalities. In which case, the election we are holding on the 26th of this month will be free, fair, democratic, and transparent. With those remarks, Mr. Speaker, I beg support.
Now, I'm unable now to know who is on which side. Member for Kajiado South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to support this bill, and a lot have been said about the specific clauses of the bill. But, Mr. Speaker, let me just generalize and say that having read this bill, I was able to conclude with 3 objectives that this bill is trying to achieve. One is we have had these elections always being, mishandled by the election officials, mostly at the grassroots level, the presiding officers and the returning officers. And therefore, one of the loopholes that this bill seeks to close is to insulate the election from the mischief of the election officials. And I think that has been elaborated even when we read about the offenses of those who mishandle the election. It is a good objective, Mr. Speaker. Again, Mr. Speaker, the courts have pronounced itself, and it has talked about so many ambiguities in the laws relating to elections. And therefore, it is good that we support these proposed amendments as another objective to actually rearrange or remove the ambiguities in the law that relating to the contact and the transmission of the results. Mostly when we talk of manual and electronic, there is need to remove those ambiguities on how to transmit these results. And my final objective in my observation is, Mr. Speaker, as it has been said, that there is need to avert the risk of the IBC chairperson being unable or unwilling to declare the winner of a presidential election. And therefore, those 3 key items, Mr. Speaker, will really make me support this bill. Again, Mr. Speaker, out there, There's been this notion of people talking of, it's not the right time, it's not the right timing to amend the election laws. But Mr. Speaker, we are about 3 weeks to the October 26th presidential election. And I remember even the most famous now minor KI case that really made a lot of fundamental changes to election laws was actually, the ruling was done exactly 3 weeks to elections. And I don't think, and no one at that time talked of the timing is not right. So why the timing is not right on this and the timing is the same? 3 weeks to election, now it is 3 weeks to election. And again, Mr. Speaker, those people talking there that out there, talking of the best practice, internationally best practice. Internationally best practice is only there in accounting procedures and practices, Mr. Speaker. But in law, Mr. Speaker, and especially at the situation where we are in now as a country, I would say it's actually politically self-serving to talk of best practice scenario. And because I would say, Mr. Speaker, Kenya is confronting a new challenge that has never been witnessed before in Africa, and only in a very handful, of the other world countries, about 3 only. Even the so-called the old democracies, Mr. Speaker, talk of the United Nations, no, not the United States of America, the United Kingdom, Mr. Speaker, France. For over 250 years now, they have not had a single presidential election in those democracies nullified by a Supreme Court, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, there is neither a precedent on what we are experiencing as a country, nor best practices, Mr. Speaker, anywhere in the world. And therefore, the current situation in Kenya is actually going to be a learning or a reference point in future for other countries, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, the Supreme Court of Kenya said that election is a process. And I fully agree with that. Election is a process. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, it is good that we amend as Parliament these laws and reorient the election laws to these processes that the Supreme Court talked about. And these processes the Supreme Court talked about, Mr. Speaker, were issues of technicalities, administrative errors, irregularities and illegalities, Mr. Speaker, rather than the results. So they based their ruling mostly on the processes rather than the results. And the results are actually the one that signifies the will of the people, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, between the two, Mr. Speaker, finally, clause 8, just 1 minute, clause 8 is the
Member for Kiharu.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I rise to support the amendments. And for a start, I want to submit to this House that the issue before us is not purely about changing our electoral laws. It is also a matter of stability of our country. Because as we have seen in many African countries and even beyond, the stability of any country is premised on how we conduct elections and thereafter. And for a start, I want to bring to the attention of this House that the news out there is that the former presidential candidate for NASA has just opted out. And I think it's a good thing for our country because probably we will end up saving a lot of billions which could otherwise be expensed in building roads in Kiharu and any other constituency within our republic. And Mr. Speaker, one of the issues I want to point out is the issue of having the IABC chairperson standing up in the gap of the chair of IABC. And I want to say that the body of IABC, being the body that brings forth the democracy of our country or takes care of our elections, should actually be the pinnacle should actually be the apex of democracy in this country. And therefore, having one person taking hostage that institution, that his duties cannot be transferred, that they are not transferable, I think it's a paradox in itself, because the same body that brings forth democracy in our country by way of conducting elections should actually set the example. The other one, Mr. Speaker, I want to say that the issue of quorum from 5 to 3, it's a very good thing. And even as a House, we have actually set an example where we have committees of more than 15 people, and we have set the quorum at actually 4. And therefore, I think it's a good thing, even in other countries. We have seen even the electoral commissions having only 3 commissioners in total. And therefore, I believe that even having a leaner team will be more efficient in terms of quorum, so that we do not have a few individuals holding our country back. And even going back to the point of the IABC chair and their responsibility, or their responsibilities being transferable, I think it also behoves of this House to also check on other institutions and to pinpoint one institution in regard to the issue at hand is the institution of the Supreme Court. Mr. Speaker, I believe we should also explore a possibility where maybe the Chief Justice is supposed to swear in the President-elect, and maybe they are not able, or they cannot make it to do that responsibility. We should also check into that, Mr. Speaker, sir, so that we can have the Deputy Chief Justice or any other judge of the Supreme Court take up that matter, so that we do not have a lacuna, we do not have a void in our electoral process as we talk about the presidential vote. And even about timing, Mr. Speaker, I find it suspect when people start claiming out there, especially politicians from NASA, that the timing of changing the electoral rules are suspect. And Mr. Speaker, in regard to the 26th, there is no way as a patient, you will go to a hospital, you are diagnosed with malaria, then you are given tablets by the doctor and prescribed to take those tablets after you get well. You are prescribed those tablets to feel well, not after you get well. And therefore, as we look at 26th in terms of the presidential election, it is very good timing for our country, because we have seen there is need, even as we proceed to the 26th, so that we fill all the voids and we fill all the vacuums, so that we will not have a situation where we run into circles as a country, where a person wins, the other one goes to the Supreme Court, and we go into a needless circle that has a huge cost even to our economy. With those few remarks, Mr. Speaker, I beg to support the motion. Thank you very much.
Member for Kajiado South.
This is Kajiado North.
North. No. I'm just following the names as they are on the.
Thank you. Thank you, Speaker.
It looks like members of the who sit to the left of Mr. Speaker were late to log in. So it looks like all the people who logged in are to the right of Mr. Speaker. So what do we do?
Thank you, Speaker, for giving me this chance to contribute to these dear amendments and support them in fury. Mr. Speaker, this is a situation in our country where the majority has been denied, and this is a time it calls for a good reasoning where we have to come up with very good rules in this country. Mr. Speaker, there are 3 issues that I will touch in this particular bill. But before I go to that one, I want to assure the opposition that Kenyans this time around will not fight because we have matured enough. We can only argue in Parliament and not go to physical part of it. Mr. Speaker, I want to say the presidency unifies this country. And making the rules of this country, especially when it comes to election of a president, we have to be very careful, and we should not leave any lacuna in place. And I think this is what this particular rule is trying to to modify. Mr. Speaker, I want to touch on Article 6, Clause A, where after the tallying or counting, then there will be manual and transmission electronically, and say that actual taking the physical copy to the tallying center is not a weakness. That is the real thing. We only go to transmission electronically because that one will be tiresome and it will be clumsy. But if we were to have any good method of transporting all the 290 from 34B to the National Tallying Center, then that could have been the correct thing. Then, when there is discrepancy between the two, between the electronic and the original one, then it is common sense the original one is the correct thing because the scanned copy is from the original. Then that is obvious that we should go with the original copy, which is the copy from the polling station. Mr. Speaker, I want also to touch a bit on the composition of commissioners. There's a time I was a commissioner in one of the commissions in the country, Teacher Service Commission, and I knew very well in our act, when you had 3 commissioners and they sat down, they deliberated the issues of commission and the decision were binding. We used to go out anywhere, you assemble 3 commissioners and you deliberate, and the action you take is an action of a commissioner. Therefore, I think this is only to streamline in the correct decision that you require only 3 commissioners to make a commission and deliberate. Because apart from the election part of it, there are other functions of the commissioners, maybe in the Electoral Commission, where they can sit down and discuss a certain polling station. You don't have to have the 9 commissioners sitting down to discuss about a polling station somewhere, but they can sit 3 of them and come up with a decision, maybe to change that polling station. Therefore, I tend to think that is a correct thing. When it comes to the qualifications, to me, I tend to think you should consider any qualified Kenyans. There is a unit in University of Nairobi that is called Pure Management Science. That one does not really focus whether you are a lawyer or something else. But if you are a real manager, you can manage this election despite the fact that you are a lawyer or you're not a lawyer. Mr. Speaker, also I want to touch on the part of the key part, that is part 10B, which I think is very important, that where one of the candidates withdraw, then it means the remaining candidate will be declared the president. I think this is what this bill is trying to address, because even in a football match, because the NASA candidate normally gives an analogy of a football match, if one team does not appear in the competition, the other one is generally awarded the marks. And this is where we should go to. I think it should be changed this way, such that if one of the candidates withdraw, then the other one is awarded the presidency, and we continue instead of taking Kenyans to another election, maybe competing with other minor people. Then, I want also to touch on the issue of penalties. If somebody deliberately fails to sign, if a PO deliberately refuses to sign, then he should be judged harshly by the laws of this country, because that is where the weakness is. We don't want to go to a petition again and we find some of the documents that were not signed. Furthermore, these returning officers and the presiding officers are paid to do the job. If they are paid to do the job, they should do the correct job, otherwise they should be punished. Then apart from that one, I tend to think we should bring more amendment and say, if a presiding officer or a returning officer sends information to any other part apart from IABC, should be penalized. Because you remember what they were saying, that they will have a tallying center somewhere, because they thought some of the presiding officer will send the correct information to their tallying center, which was to find its own way to the IBC servers, then such a person should also be punished. Therefore, the tallying or the presiding officer should send information only to IBC, otherwise that person should be punished heavily. So I tend also to think it is also very important to say this, that the scanned documents, because it is the truth one, it should be sent to the polling station and also to the National Turning Center as usual, then followed by the manual part to the Turning Center, just the way it happened for the MCAs and the members of parliament. Actually, it did not require the returning officer to wait for the scanned or the electronic transmission to the constituency to declare the member of parliament. The same thing should happen to the president. So they should wait for the physical part and then after that declare. Mr. Speaker, I want to support this one and say we should, as politicians, be sensitive to the country and make sure that at least we guide the country inside parliament through argument without taking our country in the wrong direction. Because I think the way we are taking our country through the demonstration way, it is not good for this country. We are not giving very good examples to the country. So I would request the opposition members, it is good you come to parliament and you take your respective seats so that we can argue. And also tell you, according to this current election, you have seen so many members of parliament elected on Jubilee ticket. It is good now, as Honorable Raila Odinga should say, this time he's wrong because Jubilee has a majority. He should join and ask himself, is he doing the wrong thing for this country? Because I think this time round he's wrong. With those many remarks, I want to support these amendments. Thank you very much.
Member for Kitui South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honorable Speaker, I rise to support these amendments, and I would like to congratulate my colleague, the Honorable Cheptumo, for coming up with a coherent report. Mr. Speaker, this is a very important time for us as a House to be doing the most important thing, making laws. Honorable Speaker, in our Constitution, Article 82 gives Parliament the responsibility of legislating on elections, and specifically 82D, that Parliament should legislate on the conduct of elections and referenda and any other matters that are related to elections. So this is a very important time, honorable members, and we should take our responsibility to do what we should do to ensure that we follow the Constitution and implement also Article 94 and 95 of our Constitution regarding the roles of the National Assembly. Honorable Speaker, these amendments make a lot of sense to me. I went through the report, and I also looked at the summarized clauses as presented by the committee, which I would like to say that they did a very, very good job. And I watched the patience of the chair and the members as they interviewed people from very different levels of our country, people from different parts of this country, very highly educated people, and also people who are not so highly educated, and taking the memoranda that they brought and listening to them carefully. So, Mr. Speaker, these amendments give an opportunity to IABC to have some continuity. Honorable Speaker, it is very difficult for the country to wake up every morning and find out how the officials of IABC are doing, because we are not sure if the chair is unwell, if the chair is indispensed, what is it that we could do? But I must say that as I speak, I am seated next to the Honorable Gathoni wa Mushomba, who has shared with me a 72-page document, which is a bit worrying. I do not want to comment on it on the floor of the House right now, because I have not read it fully. But I must say that we have looked at some of the issues that have been raised in a recent press statement, and it is a bit worrying. And it is good when a person is not ready for an election, it is good to withdraw, because this country is bigger than an individual. We have children who would like to grow. We have farmers who are waiting for rain so that they can grow their crops. We have businessmen who are not able to import, and they would like to import, and they are not sure of the market the next day, the next week, the next month. And because of that uncertainty, this country is losing big economically. I think a time comes when an individual makes a decision for the sake of the country. So this is something that should happen. And I believe that in a few hours, in 1-2 days, we will be sure of what decision then will be made with such a decision that is being made by an individual. Honorable Speaker, I must also say that looking ahead on the other side today, on the NASA side, there is a lot of excitement and a lot of willingness to debate, and I can see that people holding notes, willing to debate on amending the law, and I have seen goodwill. It is unfortunate that I am not able to identify the new members because they are still new, but I can tell that they are really NASA, and they are willing to support amending these laws for the sake of the country. Mr. Speaker, sir, as I said, this law is going to, amending this law is going to give continuity. And as I said, it's a bit worrying to keep on checking how the chair is. So it gives us an opportunity to identify another person who will implement the duties that would be implemented by the chair of IABC. So it gives continuity, it ensures that it's no lacuna and there is no vacuum in law. Honorable Speaker, also, changing this law ensures proper representation. With the changing of the numbers of the commissioners in IABC, and always, we cannot have all commissioners present, it has very clearly now stipulated quorum for debating matters at IABC, and it is good that they did not give a specific number, they just said half of the membership, and I think this makes a lot of sense. Honorable Speaker, this is also in line with the Constitution, Article 250, and I can see that the committee was very much aware of that, and they have said that they should not be less than 3, and they should not be more than 9. That means that they read widely, and they applied the law within their deliberations. Honorable Speaker, I have heard many people, and especially on the other side where I do not belong, and I'm very happy not to belong to that side, because it is very difficult not to live your life, not to be able to express your opinion, that you must be told what to say when you come to the House, and you must even be told what to read. Honorable Speaker, this clause 5, the amendment benefits both coalitions, both NASA and Jubilee coalitions, where we are seeing being given an opportunity to allow any person to participate in an election, including presidential elections, the Dindas and others. Honorable Speaker, I have just reflected on the meaning of Dinda, where I come from. Many people voted for Dinda because it was being pronounced by the people who are reading as Dinda, and Dinda in my community is the name of a woman. So most people would say, I would like to vote for Dinda. So I believe that he also got so many votes from my area. Honorable Speaker, this amendment gives a chance to anybody without discrimination, that is clause 5, without discrimination to participate in an election, including a presidential election. Honorable Speaker, also these amendments, especially clause 6, it makes sense in the, and I think it is the most important when it comes to using technology in elections. I think it is the most important point that I would like to speak about, because we vote manually and we do everything manually. And our voters, especially where I come from, where 50% of the people who vote are assisted voters, they do not know that somebody is supposed to sign a form. They do not know that there is form 34A, 34B. They do not know that there is watermark, and they do not even know how results are transmitted. But an election was cancelled based on a process. So clause 6 it says that the results are physically delivered. And I think it is important because we know very well that technology fails. It has failed. It can fail now, and it will definitely fail in the future. So this is a very important amendment for our people. Also in the same clause, it talks about verification. It was a shame to notice that there were documents which were clearly wrong, and the IABC officials did not verify the changes that may have been made by individuals, either by making a mistake or deliberately. And I think this is important, that people must be forced to verify the information that has been written. And also ensuring that this information, as it reaches the constituency tallying centers, also our people are, or the Kenyans are kept updated on how elections are going. It is important. Honorable Speaker, I would like to say that this is a very important amendment, and it is worth being put within the law. Honorable Speaker, matters of procedure. It is a shame that a matter of procedure can bring about cancellation of an election, and that is what we saw, and we have already seen the impact of this within our streets, where we have people running around. It was a shame to see a woman yesterday. I saw a picture today in the newspaper of a woman who decided just to walk around as a main street in the city, clad in a brassiere. This is a country that we love. This is a country where we have children, and our children are asking us, Mama, why is this woman improperly dressed? So I would like to thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for giving me a chance to talk about
Member for Geshogo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for that opportunity to contribute in this debate. Mr. Speaker, first of all, I must be excited. People from outside this country, it is not upon people who are demonstrating in the streets to dictate to the members of parliament of the National Assembly as to when they should be registrating in order to put the electoral laws in this country into the right path. Mr. Speaker, having said so, the amendments that are sought in this bill are very crucial for the stability of this country and for proper election. The Commission, because when the Commission is being formed, they normally go through very rigorous vetting process, and each one of the members of the Commission can as well chair and preside over the proceedings of the Commission. So when the chairman may not be present for whatever reason, the vice chair and any other member, if the vice chair is not present, can be elected and the business of the commission.
And especially those that relate to electoral process, so that going forward we do not have individuals who would want or would not want the country to move forward, and in the process embarrass us even within the East African community, even within